with anybody else other than with Stop the Crime. And he's alone. He feels lonely. And he said after we called and were setting up the interview with him and during the show last night, he felt hopeful again, had power again. He didn't feel as lonely. He's getting ready to return to Poland. They're taking his land. And I asked him to describe to us what's happening in Poland that may not have yet happened here in the United States. And one of the things he said is that it is now becoming illegal for citizens in Poland to share email addresses or phone numbers with other people. They're cutting us off. They're cutting us off. I'll end it by saying one final thing. The emergency alert program was intentionally non-communicating. There is a corporation called AirWatch that can push a button at a single console and go to any cell phone, anywhere, at any time. And all of you may remember the presidential cell phone alert. That went everywhere. And instead, what they decided to do was to create the illusion that the alert cell phone systems weren't working because the cell phone towers burned down, etc. And to come in with cameras, to create more of a visual recognition reality with Landsat, LANDSAT, overhead satellites to track and monitor every one of us. I went to Cuba, and I don't know how much more time I have. Would you like me to make a few comments about Cuba?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So, I will tell you this, and I don't usually tell this story, but I'll give you a few sentences about it. I lived on my family's boat in Holland back in the mid-60s. And we were going to crew it back to the United States. Well, after surviving some horrific storms in the Bay of Biscay and feeling that I might not make it back to the United States, after a year of sailing, I flew out of Gibraltar and came home. My family, my dad, my brother, and his wife came back to the United States. And long story short, a long story, very short, my father ended up being picked up by a Soviet submarine in the embargo between Cuba in international waters, and he was pirated off of international waters on our boat in the beginning of 1970. And he was imprisoned in La Cabaña prison for 4 years. There was about 6 months that we thought he was lost at sea. We didn't know where he was. And he got out after I was married, and Lou had met him then. And of course, when I met Lou and he wanted to know where my parents was, he thought I was crazy that I said my dad was in Cuban prison. But I was lucky that my dad made it out, because the treatment of Chavez overflowed into the diabolical torturing that happens to the Cuban prisoners. Cuba is a prison island. I typed out the prisons, and there were over 17 pages of prisons in Cuba. And I wanted to go there now that Cuba's opened up for travel, and see the prisons where my father was, just from the outside. I just wanted to see where he was, because he was tortured. They would put them in boxes and shove them in the wall like mausoleum boxes, and put them out in the center of the prison yard in a dugout area with a metal grate over it, and march the Cuban children by there to torment the prisoners. And many of the prisoners died. It was a time when we were seeing many Continental Airlines was being pirated to Cuba oftentimes in those days. In fact, people joked about via Havana. And no one really understood where those pirateers, or those people that took over those airlines were going. Well, they were being put in prison with all the other American prisoners, and they were causing a tremendous amount of increased withholding of food with sunlight and increased torture. When you were in prison, you had a number, and you could not look any guards in the face. You had to look down, and they moved you around so that you would not become familiar with the guards, because they were young guards, and they weren't compassionate, and there was no connection. So we went to Cuba with the idea that I wanted to see these prisons and just know where my dad had been during a really important time in my life. And I was watching the other visitors in Cuba that went there with the memory of Hemingway and all of the Cuban cars that you see being driven around and getting drunk in the bars and not looking at the real Cuba. So we hired some interpreters, and we said we didn't want that at all. We wanted to see the real Cuba. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of what we saw. And I'm going to give you a little history first. Castro was a CIA agent, and he was a lawyer in the United States, and he was put in place by the Vatican. The Vatican ran and runs Cuba. They ran drugs out of Cuba. They ran pedophile rings and human trafficking out of Cuba. And they still do. And I can tell you that I did not know about Operation Peter Pan. I'm going to tell you about Operation Peter Pan. During the transition of Batista and Castro in the mid-60s, the Vatican worked with local priests that were in Cuba, and over the radio and in the papers, the Cuban elite were told that their children were going to be put in re-education centers, taken 16 years of age and under. Their children of the Cuban elite, this is a brain drain, were going to be taken. So they said there was a choice, though, that the Cuban elite could send their children to America where they'd be safe. So they drummed up false visas, got them on American Airlines and other American planes, and shipped 14,000 Cuban children to the United States, of which 50% of them were never found again. Never found. We were there in Cuba with a number of people that were going back to Cuba to see where their family had lived when they were exited when they were only 5. Some of those that escaped prior to being unable to escape, and hearing their stories. We also did not know that the embargo against Cuba was also an embargo of the climate. I did not know that there was an operation called Operation Blue Nile or Nile Blue. It was withholding the precipitation from Cuba so that Castro would not make the monies necessary to continue on the path that he was on. Rothschild wanted more control and fighting and all of that. I did not know about that. But that was during the same time of Operation Popeye in the Vietnam War. Now, for all of you, because we know the weather's controlled, we also know that they could have put the fires out, and they chose not to. So for any doubting Thomases, anybody that you have difficulty discussing the reality with, you can refer them to the documents on Stop the Crime that shows Pacific Gas and Electric in the early 50s was working on cloud seeding. And they accomplished cloud seeding for the benefit of enhancement of the electricity that they could get from increasing the reservoir. And so all the way back then, PG&E has been involved with the weather modification here in California. And it's all fully documented, fully documented. What else did we see when we were in Cuba? We saw what it's going to look like here. So what do I mean by that? The water system is fractured and highly contaminated, just like it is here, but we're drinking it. So we were told not to drink any of the water, not to buy off of vendors in the street, because you couldn't get the produce because it was, the water was contaminated. And so in many of the cities in Cuba, they turn the water on maybe only 1 or 2 hours a day. And in some of the cities, it might be only turned on every month or so. So the Cuban people have cisterns on their roofs. So when the water's turned on, the water can fill the cistern as much as they can get it to fill. And then it gravity feeds down. They don't have enough money for the electricity aspect of any of that because the Cubans earn $20 a month. They're subsidized by the government, $20 a month. Now they can work for tourism and get tips and so forth, and that helps to augment their income, but not everybody is in that position. And there's multi-generational families living in these little, roughly constructed structures. There can be 10 to 15 people living in a 2-bedroom without much water. And they get food rationing, they get food cards. We have pictures of the food cards. As soon as we can get our 15 hours of footage put together, because I don't think any of you are going to want to watch 15 hours of YouTube, right? Unless you want to travel to Cuba with us, and maybe you would like to. But we have photographs of all of this, and we shot videos in the markets where the Cubans are able to utilize their food cards. Their markets, let me see if I can describe a market to you. Imagine a garage that's been kind of burned out a bit, and it's somewhat dirty and musty, and the plywood on the shelves is sagging, and there's a couple of items on the shelves. While the Cubans are allowed up to 5 eggs a month on their ration cards, most of the time there are no eggs. Now my father told me when he was in Cuban prison that he met many Cubans that were in prison for up to 12 years. That's how he learned Spanish fluently. Because they were there because they were stealing food for their family. The sentencing for stealing food in Cuba is anywhere from 5 to 15 years. It's a lesser sentence if you kill somebody. So as we're traveling through the streets and we're looking at the Cuban people and we're talking to our guides, we would ask for more descriptions. And our guides would say, well, we can't talk here. And we would look around. And we filmed a number of Stasi police in plain clothes hiding in bushes. This is the network of community organization and snitch that they have on. The cities are divided up more or less in quadrants of 800 homes, and there's a single doctor that is in the middle of this, and all the Cubans in that district go to that one doctor. I can say that they are much more holistically influenced than we are here. Big Pharma has not grabbed them as much because they couldn't afford Big Pharma anyway. But vaccinations are required now. Vaccinations are now required in Cuba. I was saddened. And because of the coastlines under attack, I hope most of you have watched that YouTube. It's called Coastlines Under Attack, Storm Surge Artificially Created. We were looking at what is in store for Cuba. Much of it is very low-lying, and we're watching and saw the erosion around the peripheral of Cuba now, as in many countries now. The military, of course, is run by our overlords, however you want to call them, and against us. And we're going to sacrifice coastlines around the peripheral of all nations, all countries, worldwide. And when I first found out about coastlines under attack, because many of you know that my husband and I were in land development for a number of decades. We're third-generation builders. And when I see things that pop up in a city meeting, for example, what popped up for me about Coastlines Under Attack and how Coastlines Under Attack came to be, give you a little bit of the backstory so you'll know the kinds of things we find and how we link it together. I found a very interesting article out of Marina, Del Mar, thank you, Lynn. Del Mar in Southern California, a very wealthy beach community. And there were residents lining up at the city hall thinking that they have any input at all, but saying that they did not want to have in their code, in their new code book, an update of planned retreat. And I thought, what on earth is planned retreat in the new code? Until I looked it up. The definition for planned retreat means you allow your home to be consumed by the sea because of sea level rise. And I'm very familiar, and I hope most of you are too, with the NASA War document that I talk about. And I found in the NASA War document Project SEAL or Operation SEAL, SEAL. And it was called the Blast Wave Accelerator, and that was used in World War II, or that was going to be used in World War II, had either one of the atomic bombs not detonated over Japan. The United States and Auckland had worked together to create a tsunami, and it was a 33-foot tsunami that they claimed they could create. Well, of course, since then, there have been many technological advancements in the creation of tsunamis. And the Russians have robotic submarines that can create 300-foot tsunamis. So what I want to tell you about Cuba is that the people are starving, and the visitors are eating them off their island. I'm going to explain that. So when we vacate cities here in California, and we move to Oregon, or we move to other states, we bring generally more money with us, and we buy property elsewhere that's not as expensive. And in those other local communities, we start to price them out of their ability to buy properties themselves. Well, what has happened with the influx now of visitors into Cuba is that they're now building more hotels and more restaurants. That, of course, will mean some more menial jobs for the Cubans. But they don't have the food supply to feed the people. Their rice is actually brought in from Vietnam, and they don't have a water system that can harness the desires of those that go there to visit Cuba. And so food prices are becoming more expensive for the Cubans themselves. They can barely now get enough to eat because we're robbing and raping and pillaging them, and we don't know it. But now you do. Now you do. So if you go to Cuba, I would recommend you do. It's a good place to see. But I would recommend you go on a ship where all of your meals are provided, so that you don't have to drink anything on shore or eat anything on shore. Don't take from them, but go, if you can, and see how they've been living under a totalitarian socialist regime, under the Vatican, and see and look at the massive wetlands that is in central Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. Massive wetlands. They literally have mosquito spraying teams in all of the big cities, dousing areas with mosquito repellent. We filmed that as well. And I would say my take home from Cuba was seeing what is coming here in a vengeance. The reduction of water, the contamination of our water supply, and systems here with wastewater treatment plants that are being designed to fail. Now, why do I say that? When we discovered what was happening with the geothermal operations, and the hydrogen sulfide that they emit, our bodies absorb a certain amount of hydrogen sulfide, and it's excreted through our urine. And one morning before a radio show, I just happened to see an article, and under this picture of a wastewater treatment plant in Madera, in California, Madera, under the picture of the wastewater treatment plant, it said that the plant's concrete was disintegrating and that the wastewater treatment plant was ready to fail, that the disintegration of the concrete was all the way down to the rebar. And they discovered it was because of hydrogen sulfide. And they did not know where it came from, out of our urine, folks. Because Rothschild is making sure that we're going to have 100% renewable energy by creating hundreds of geothermal operations worldwide. We know that it's a possibility, and I only say this as a possibility, that the Napa earthquake could have been the result of the fracking, or they like to call it injections, up there on the Mayakan Mountains. We don't know that for sure, but what we do know is that the USGS has monitoring stations for earthquake all over that mountain. And they have admitted to a 5.0 earthquake. And we're talking about multiple earthquakes every single day. So when I was at the Santa Rosa City Council meeting last Tuesday and came back totally traumatized, I call it truth trauma, because I felt I was at a Bilderberg meeting designing the end of the world, and yet I was in Santa Rosa listening to them design the end of Santa Rosa. And I came back absolutely, I have to say, very, very traumatized. And I did get up and speak a couple of times. They were talking about the need to have resilient preparation around future fires, around earthquakes, and around floods and other weather weaponized events and intentional events. So I got up and I told them, then why don't you stop the geothermal operation in the mountains and stop the earthquakes? Why are you injecting wastewater treatment, urine, and pharmaceuticals in those boreholes and causing acid rain? Why don't you stop that? Because PG&E is behind it and Rothschild runs the show. So I knew that it was just a moment for me to vent my anxiety. It was cheaper than going to a shrink. They don't know what's going on anyway. So I can say to you that if you go to a meeting, just understand they're designed off of the Tavistock Institute and the Rand Corporation and the World Bank's theory of running policies through and giving you the illusion that you have input. In fact, I want to talk about this document next. I don't know how much more time I have. A little more time. A little more time. Is everybody up for a little more time? Okay. I want to talk about this document, and I've referred to it in some of the recent YouTubes that I have up. Again, one of the YouTubes that I talk quite a bit extensively about this document, and I wasn't sure how I thought about naming it this, but I went with it, and I told you this earlier. Nuke the people, and cook the books. We actually had to get a clearance for that name. So I'm just telling you that I had about an hour and 45 minutes on an uninterrupted radio show where I went over this plan and other plans as well, and it was quite extensive. But what I want to tell you a little bit about is Fukushima. Now, Fukushima occurred on March the 11th of 2011, and I'm going to tell you what it tells us in this document. And I did not understand this until I read the events of Fukushima in this document in one paragraph, because the events of those days were complicated by what's happening. There was a 9.0 earthquake, and then there was a 50-foot tsunami, and then there were floods, and it was just chaos. So I'm going to tell you this distinctly so that you understand. Okay. All right. When the nuclear power station loses off-site and on-site power for prolonged periods, they melt down. On March 11th of 2011, a 50-foot tsunami, intentional tsunami, my words, occurred, caused by a 6.0 earthquake, a weaponized weather earthquake. And inundated the Fukushima nuclear power station, which is situated on Japan's coastline. Remember the blast wave accelerator in World War II? Ready to wipe out the low-lying areas in Japan? Just remember that. It's important to note that the Fukushima facility employed General Electric reactors. General Electric reactors. They also, Japan's regulatory structure was modeled after the United States, and the plant's staff were trained in accordance with U.S. standards and procedures. Everything was state-of-the-art and in line with best U.S. practices. The U.S. has left us defenseless against meltdowns of all of our reactors here in this country, and we are going to be a massive Fukushima with the power outages. Let's be clear on that. Let's be very clear on that. Unless we start yelling from the top of the trees and the mountains that we know this, because now you do. So here's how they shifted the blame so that none of the equipment from General Electric would be held liable. None of the procedures would be held liable. TIPCO would not be held liable, nor would the U.S. But the U.S. is state-of-the-art, best U.S. practices. They said that to prevent the meltdown, water is normally circulated through electrically powered cooling systems. Nearly all the nuclear reactor cooling systems were of similar design. That means all of them are similar design here in this country. Since the Fukushima facility had no electricity after the tsunami, it should have been able to revert to the backup emergency core cooling system, which is usually electrically powered by emergency generators. However, the generators that would have powered the emergency cooling systems were damaged by the flooding. That's how they pawned this whole disaster off and how they decimated this and planned this disaster. Now, many of you know that we have abalone failures along our coastline. Dungeness crab is toxic. Our coral reefs and starfish are turning into mush. And we know that likely much of what occurred with the Fukushima radiation could be responsible for that. But we also know, and thanks to Rosalind Peterson for all of the hard work on informing me about the United States and the Navy military on our coastlines doing and having military practice. She had all these beautiful little postcards out advising us about the use of electromagnetic frequencies on all of our coastlines. Now, many of you may have watched the YouTube we have up, The Cooking of Humanity. In that YouTube, I'm holding a document that we never talked about. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the backstory of that document. It was about a 14-page document that we got off the US.gov website. It shows a map of the United States, and around the perimeter is radar. You see the radar around all the oceans of the United States. So what has happened is we are being moved inland to higher altitudes where oxygen is further depleted, because that is what is happening. That is what is happening. Depletion of not only the atmospheric oxygen, but also the oxygen in the water, which is why we have increased algae blooms, molds and mildews in the water systems. I mean, as many of you may recall, a few months ago in Florida, the governor had a state of emergency for all of the toxic blooms that were literally clogging up the canals. Very dangerous. And that is because in the summertime, when the environment is hot and we have increased electromagnification in the environment, and it's hotter because they're holding everything down lower on us, the ponds and pools and the industry waste, when it's injected into the cooler streams, it is literally taking the oxygen out of those cooler streams, killing the fish, and causing more algae. This is all part of the plan. You've killed all the salmon. Don't worry, it's your fault. And because there's too many people using too much stuff. So another thing that I found urgent about this document, and again, it's called Electromagnetic Defense Task Force 2018 report. There are other reports that link to this about what to do in a cataclysmic power outage, because they make it very clear that the United States has no capability of putting our system, our grid, back online. That there would be logistical problems with getting workers in designated areas to work on blown out transformers. There's not going to be enough materials. They don't have enough equipment. We see that happening here in Northern California with the fire rebuilds. We know that there are not enough employers and workers to rebuild. Also, the cost of building materials has skyrocketed. So with a power grid, when we have various outages, and I found a document that said PG&E did not clear the power lines from a gray pine tree, and that back in 2015 killed several people and burned 500 and some odd homes. I didn't remember that particular event, but right under that event it said that because of the lack of vegetation clearing. Now we've been poised to be psyops in believing that PG&E is taking the fall. They've admitted that it's the lack of vegetation clearing. Now Rothschild does not admit to absolute failure unless there's a back plan, and there is a back plan. And I can only say to you that it's planned power outages, because when I look at other climate action plans, it says that in the plans, power outages. In this plan too, they talk about the 5G. I know many of you are most concerned about the 5G, but you'll discover in this plan it's a military weapon. It's rolling out, and they're creating redundant systems of 5G, both underground, top side, and through satellites. It's a military operation, and they're saying that 5G must occur because whoever has the 5G infrastructure first, and they claim they're in a race against China, Russia, who cares? They're in a race. And whoever controls the 5G network first controls the internet and all data worldwide. Trillions and trillions and trillions. So I would suggest that we put our brains together, come up with ways in which we can survive the increased frequencies that are going to occur in our living spaces and in our environments. And I know that as soon as many people start to think about this, we can come up with methods of survival, and at least to survive just a little bit longer. This document talks about black starts. Again, that's an EMP. I would recommend that you read the book Lou and I did a number of years ago. It's called 1 Second After. It's a novel. And it was written to wake up people to create a visualization of what it would look like when the power goes down. And I will tell you that Lou and I experienced a power outage the weekend before last for 6 hours. And it was the best thing that could have happened. It was horrible. It was awful. And we made a list of things we needed in order to withstand a longer duration of an outage. And we were going to, my family members joked around and said, well, let's have a power outage party. Let's come over to your house, Mom and Dad, and shut the power off and see how well we do for the weekend. Let's have fun with it. Well, I tried to find humor in that, but I guess we have to live with some humor because it's a pretty deep, dark reality that we find ourselves in. And again, I just want to thank all of you for coming. And please sign up for StopTheCrime.net if you haven't. Get a hold of our YouTubes. Spread that one YouTube we have up about the windows and the low E energy windows that cause fires. So if you haven't taken a look at that YouTube, you can also just type in your search bar, low E energy windows and fires. They're the new preferred window replacement by the Department of Energy that is killing us, along with the LED lights. There was one more thing. I wanted to say one more thing and I'm going to close it up. I'm losing my voice. Okay, we're all hearing about net zero energy. We're hearing about the new building codes saying net zero energy. We went to Sonoma Academy, a school in Santa Rosa, yesterday, and they were giggling and jumping around in such delight that they were building a building that equated equation to net zero energy. But I brought my EMF tester in, and it was not fit for human life. So I asked them, all frequency, all energy is energy, period. You don't create energy in a vacuum. And net zero energy is only half the story. Don't buy it. When you hear net energy being discussed in designing new homes, or you hear it on the news, on a talk show, and you're able to call in a talk show, which is what we try to do all the time, you have to get past the call screen, so you may not want to be so direct. But you have to think, what is really net zero energy? It's the combination of all energy combined. And they're only showing half the story. It's just like Barry Trower told us. The heating system of microwaves, all the scientists were ever able to discuss was heat, just the heat. So when you hear net zero energy, in fact, we're going to be filming some conversations on February 22nd and asking these purveyors of disinfo to describe and define what net zero energy is. And we're going to have a lot of fun with that, so you can watch that on StopTheCrime.net. And I just thank you so much, all of you, for coming. And I'm hoping that we can meet up more often. Val, amazing job in putting this together. So thrilled that all of you are here. We do need to be here more often for one another because I can only say with what is occurring, we're heading into some difficult times ahead. And I just caution people to remember to have joy and gratitude in your heart as much as you can. We're still human. We're all still human.